Good afternoon. This hearing of the U.S. Senate Permanent Subcommittee on Investigations will come to order. I want to first thank the witnesses for your time and effort in appearing here today for your testimony. In conjunction with this hearing, I am releasing an interim report titled, Unmasked, How Biden Health Officials Purposely Turned a Blind Eye Toward COVID-19 Vaccine, or I call them injection, injuries, safety signals. I urge everyone tuning into today's hearing to read the full report to determine for yourself how the title is as accurate as it is incriminating. To set the stage for what follows, let me remind everyone that Dr. David Morans, now indicted for this, under conspiracy and destruction of records charges, he was an advisor to Anthony Fauci, emailed to colleagues on how to evade Freedom of Information requests. Quote, I learned from our FOIA lady here how to make emails disappear, and how he wanted, quote, correspondence on sensitive issues to be sent to me at my Gmail address, unquote. Included in this report is additional evidence of how federal health officials avoided creating a paper trail to prevent transparency and public disclosure. In discussing how they've been warned of a major limitation of FDA's data mining system, one senior FDA official wrote, quote, we should meet internally. Many considerations not suited to email, unquote. Other federal officials appear to have openly acknowledged that they were actively attempting to avoid transparency. A CDC official discussing the sharing of vaccine safety data stated, quote, I think because of the FOIAs, we may have asked FDA to stop sending these weekly data mining outputs, unquote. In spite of their concerted effort to conceal what they knew, and when they knew it, documents we've retained, thanks to Secretary Kennedy's responsiveness to my subpoena and his commitment to radical transparency, paint a clear picture of an obvious cover-up by federal health officials. Our report shows how FDA officials were warned and fully aware of their safety surveillance system's inability to adjust for a statistical phenomenon called masking, which according to medical researchers occurs when, quote, signals for a vaccine of interest are hidden by presence of other reported vaccines, unquote. Rather than use a newer state-of-the-art system that can adjust for masking, Biden health officials purposefully chose to employ the older system that conceals the signals for serious adverse events associated with the COVID injection. Throughout 2021, FDA officials received multiple analyses from the state-of-the-art system showing statistically significant safety signals for adverse events, but made a conscious decision to ignore that data. On October 22, 2020, CDC's Tom Shimbakuro touted VAERS by saying it can, quote, rapidly detect safety signals and can detect rare adverse events, unquote. But in an email a year later, when VAERS was reporting worldwide adverse events of 837,595 and 17,619 deaths, Dr. Shimbakuro stated, quote, it's not a database that should be used for serious surveillance and research. And we have up on the screen a chart that I produced almost weekly once I started tracking this. And you'll notice it compares different drugs, adverse events reported, those things, deaths per year. You can see at the top of the chart, ivermectin appears to be a pretty safe drug. At the very bottom, COVID vaccines, and again, this is in October of 2021, 17,619 deaths. It's important to note that 32% of those occurred either on the day of vaccination or within 1 or 2 days of vaccination. I know VAERS doesn't prove causation, but that is a correlation that federal health officials ought to be looked at. In reaction to the skyrocketing number of deaths and adverse events, other Biden administration and federal health officials were also publicly denigrating VAERS with comments like, quote, falsified VAERS report, potentially misleading VAERS posts, frequently misused by anti-vaccine activists, and, quote, conspiracy theorists, science deniers, and anti-vaccine activists can fill out the form. Now, this is quite honestly contrary to reports in terms of the high percentage that are actually reported by medical professionals. The federal health agencies had to be sued twice before a court finally forced him to disclose the results of the VSAFE system, an online self-reporting safety for surveillance system created specifically for the mRNA COVID injections. Here's why they fought so hard to keep that from public view. Of the 10 million people who voluntarily provided information to VSAFE, 7.7% sought medical care for COVID injection adverse events, and 25% lost time at work or couldn't perform their daily routine following injection. Even though I wrote 21 letters requesting information on what the agencies were tracking and what they knew about adverse events, I didn't need sophisticated mathematical models to tell me the COVID injection was causing significant harm. The data depicted on these charts alone should have raised the alert level to DEFCON 1. Now, this first chart is showing deaths reported on VAERS since the inception of VAERS. You can see starting in 1990, deaths were approximately a couple hundred per year, anaphylactic shock, those types of things. In 2021, deaths spiked to 21,631. Now, again, I didn't need a mathematical algorithm to tell me there's something going on here. And by the way, a lot of people will say, well, that's because we administered billions of doses. One of the letters I wrote to the CDC showed the rate of death per dose, compared it to the flu, which is about 0.46 deaths per million doses. Time we calculated this, the COVID injection was 25.5 deaths per million doses. That's a 55-fold increase over the deaths for the flu vaccine. So something was going on here. Our federal health officials should be paying attention. Let's do the next chart. This is the most up-to-date VAERS chart now. It's showing 39,077 deaths worldwide reported to VAERS. And understand, and we'll be adding this to the record, the Pilgrim report. An HHS-funded Pilgrim study at Harvard University showed that adverse events for vaccines are reported at less than 1%. So this grossly understates the number of adverse events and deaths, and you can see adverse events are almost 1.7 million. Multiply that times what, 100, 30? These are dramatically understated. In spite of these shocking numbers, federal health officials continued to recommend the injection, claiming it both safe and effective. By comparison, in 1976, after approximately 25 to 30 deaths and over 500 cases of Guillain-Barré syndrome, the swine flu vaccine was pulled from the market. Biden federal health officials were clearly not as vigilant in reacting to what VAERS was showing. For over 4 years, I have wondered how health officials could possibly ignore this overwhelming evidence of harm. Now I know. Our report details that on March 1st, 2021, less than 3 months after the COVID injections received an emergency use authorization, Peter Marks, the head of CBER, and officials reporting to him were warned by FDA's Dr. Anna Scharfman, and an individual who these officials recognize as an expert in FDA's data mining, that the current system would mask safety signals for COVID injection adverse events. Dr. Scharfman proposed a new model, a new method, invented by Dr. William Dumichel of Oracle, the inventor of the current algorithm, to uncover the hidden safety signals. On March 26, 2021, 26 days later, Dr. Scharfman sent Dr. Dumichel's data analysis to senior FDA officials showing that the new analytical method found, quote, 49 examples of extreme masking and uncovered approximately 25 statistically significant safety signals of adverse events associated with COVID injection, including, let's put up the next chart here. Here's the sheet. These are the adverse events that they were showing a safety signal for using the new method: Bell's palsy, sinus rhythm, cardiac failure, chronic, acute left ventricular failure, agonal rhythm, which is severe arrhythmia generally occurred at the end of life, pulmonary infarction, cerebral artery occlusion, aortic stenosis, sudden cardiac death, hypertensive emergency, basal ganglia stroke. Now these aren't minor. Remember, we're always told, adverse events are rare and minor. These are not minor adverse events, and these safety signals were showing, and they were strong, but they were being hidden because FDA officials refused to acknowledge that the current system they were using was invalidated. And they had to look at the new system that unmasked these things. Our report goes on to detail how federal officials refused to acknowledge these revelations or take action to warn the public. Instead, senior FDA officials repeatedly tried to stop Dr. Scharfman from continuing her work or communicating her findings outside of FDA. In September 2021, Dr. Marks informed Dr. Patricia Cavazzoni, the then director of CDER, that Dr. Scharfman, who was a CDER employee, quote, has been asked to cease and desist conducting her data analysis. Dr. Marks complained that Dr. Scharfman's work had become, quote, a major distraction, that her efforts could create erroneous conflicts that feed to anti-vaccination rhetoric. Dr. Peter Stein, the then director of CDER's Office of New Drugs, reported to Dr. Marks that his office had, quote, made it clear to Dr. Scharfman, quote, that she should not be discussing and providing internal analyses externally and needs to focus on her assigned work. Dr. Scharfman, who retired from the FDA in 2025 after more than 35 years of service, told PSI staff in a recent interview that she believed her FDA colleagues saw her as a, quote, pest and, quote, persona non grata, unquote, because she was raising concerns about masking. Our witnesses today are medical researchers and experts in scientific data collection. They will help clarify the masking issue and describe why this cover-up was so egregious. I want to thank them for their time and effort they put into our testimony. I also want to thank Secretary Kennedy for his commitment to radical transparency and for promising to make HHS personnel with knowledge of these events available for interviews with subcommittee. And I also want to give a huge shout out to my staff. These are the folks who found a needle in a haystack in a document production from one of the universities that we were investigating 2.5 years ago. Found that David Morin's email where he was talking about being able to, being told how to make emails disappear and to use his Gmail. So these are the folks who did that, and these are the folks who have combed through 11 million pages to find and discover this egregious cover-up. So thank you, guys, and with that, I'll turn it over to Senator Blumenthal.
Thanks, Chairman Johnson. Amid everything that's been said, I think we ought to remember what it was like during the height of the COVID pandemic. Literally, the fear, the death, the loss, and then the relief as a result of Operation Warp Speed, which President Trump ordered, in having a vaccine that gave people hope and many people life. At the same time, none of the relief or hope enabled loved ones to come back. They lost lives, and families had their lives upended, and we can never forget the heroes in our healthcare system who braved COVID in delivering care to people who needed it in hospitals, many of them for weeks, sometimes months. We are fortunate to have with us Maria Young. Thank you for coming here today, who spent many days in a hospital, close to 70 days in intensive care. Most lives were forever changed as a result, but the vaccine offered a path forward for so many people, and we should be thankful for Operation Warp Speed. In January 2021, more than 20,000 Americans were dying each week from COVID-19. Between 2020 and 2025, more than 1.2 million Americans lost their lives to COVID-19. That's 1.2 million parents, children, friends, loved ones. And those deaths changed not only their families, but their communities and our nation. Husbands lost wives, parents lost children, and in addition to those who perished, millions were infected and many of them suffered life-changing injuries from the virus. And employers suffered economically, as did our overall economy. And the survivors still bear, many of them still bear the scars of that experience emotionally, if not physically. Years of scientific analysis have shown that COVID-19 vaccines save lives and prevented serious illnesses like the one that Ms. Young suffered. I don't agree with President Trump on a lot, but I have to give him credit for the work that was done to create COVID-19 vaccines in record time. But instead of talking about the success and remembering the ones we lost, vaccine opponents have turned one of the greatest scientific breakthroughs in our country's history into fodder for political attack. I don't get it. Today's hearing purports to discuss a cover-up of side effects of the COVID-19 vaccine, as if serious flaws in vaccines were purposely ignored. And let me be clear, they were not ignored. They were not disregarded. They were not covered up. The majority's report cherry-picks emails and misconstrues an internal debate between scientists who were actively looking for ways to detect side effects to support a predetermined and flawed thesis that COVID-19 vaccines have done more harm than good. That's not the scientific method, to have a preconceived result and then frame the evidence to fit the outcome. The report and documents that the majority has released simply do not support the notion of any kind of cover-up, nor do the reports and documents do anything to change our understandings of the vaccines as safe and effective. These points are important for the public to understand. And with all due respect, nothing that Chairman Johnson has released shows the vaccines were linked to any adverse effects beyond the rare ones that health officials have acknowledged. Indeed, the risk of stroke he claims was hidden not only was studied openly, but later shown not to exist. Without objection, I would like to enter into the record the 4 studies demonstrating that COVID-19 vaccines and boosters saved lives, Mr. Chairman.
Without objection.
There is also a really deep irony in the majority's argument, given the current administration's overt effects to skew science and undermine public health. Last week, I wrote to the acting CDC director, Dr. Jay Bhattacharya, about reports that he has blocked publication of a recent study showing that COVID-19 vaccines were extremely effective at preventing hospitalizations last winter. That study still has not been formally released, although I understand that a copy was somehow leaked, literally hours before this hearing, magically released, but not officially. And therefore, I call on the CDC director to officially release that report. Again, I asked my letter to him to be entered into the record if there's no objection.
Without objection.
I sincerely hope we never face another pandemic. I think most Americans join in that hope. And that we are still able to find dedicated scientists and, yes, pharmaceutical companies willing to work around the clock to find vaccines and cures, and public officials who are willing to support and encourage and to fund them with resources. I fear that this administration's actions to politicize science and slash scientific funding and to expel talented scientists are doing irreparable harm to our nation's ability to counter the next pandemic. The threat remains real and present, and we must respect science and encourage our scientists to continue to do their work. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Senator Blumenthal. Before we swear in witnesses, I'd like to enter a number of records into the record. First, the majority staff interim report and the 596 pages and 10 spreadsheets that support that report. Second, my December 15th, 2025 letter to HHS Secretary Kennedy requesting information about an internal FDA memo on deaths of children following COVID-19 vaccination. Then my March 23rd, 2026 letter to Secretary Kennedy detailing the subcommittee's findings about masking and how federal health officials ignored and downplayed the risk of ischemic stroke following vaccination of Pfizer's COVID-19 bivalent booster. And finally, a 2010 report entitled Electronic Support for Public Health Vaccine Adverse Events Reporting System. Again, this is the what they call the Pilgrim study done by Harvard. So I'd like to enter those in the record.
Mr. Chairman, as I indicated previously, I have a Judiciary Committee hearing, and I'll be right back.
Okay, sounds good. Without objection, on my entering records into the... So it is the tradition of this subcommittee to swear in witnesses, so if you all rise and raise your right hand. Do you swear or affirm the testimony you will give before this subcommittee will be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God? Please be seated. Our first witness is Dr. David Wiseman. Dr. Wiseman is the president of Synekion. Did I get that close? Pretty close. Synekion. There you go. I actually practiced that beforehand, and I still blew it. An R&D company focused on fibrosis and pain. He received his PhD from the University of Manchester and has a background in experimental pathology, pharmacology, and immunology. From 1987 to 94, he worked at Johnson & Johnson, rising to the position of research fellow, leading a program that included pharmacovigilance. Dr. Wiseman has published in numerous top scientific journals, including the Journal of the American College of Surgeons. Dr. Wiseman.
You hear me? Distinguished Chairman, Ranking Member, and committee members, with today's stunning revelations, I'm humbled to discuss critical flaws in statistical safety signal and potential risk detection in VAERS, touted by CDC as the nation's early warning system for vaccine safety, and credited by former CBER Director Marks with detecting both potential and actual safety issues and informing vaccine policy decisions. Among limitations undermining detection of statistical safety signals is the problem of masking. Masking occurs when statistical signals for one vaccine in a database are obscured by reports associated with other vaccines. For example, Moderna's myocarditis signal becomes hidden if its comparison baseline is artificially inflated by including Pfizer's myocarditis signal reports. In a simple analogy, hemlock and arsenic appear equally toxic when compared separately with a non-toxic baseline control such as tea. However, if hemlock's baseline data include arsenic data, hemlock's signal is drowned out or masked, appearing innocuous. Today's report shows that senior FDA staff were apprised of the masking problem both prior to COVID vaccine rollout and repeatedly by Dr. Anna Schaafman. Dr. Schaafman is a veteran FDA statistician lauded for bringing the empirical Bayesian method into FDA after collaborating with its inventor and developer of the associated Empirica signal software, Oracle's Dr. William Dumichel. Schaffman communicated Dumouchel's findings of extreme masking, including death, myocardial infarction, stroke, and dementia, noting that I am not astonished that FDA's analysis was unable to detect these signals. She repeatedly advised colleagues of Dumouchel's improved procedures, not brand new, they'd been around a while, to address masking in the same Empiricus signal software used by FDA and commercially available. Nonetheless, officials attempted to contain Dr. Schaffman, asking her to cease and desist. Elsewhere, officials claimed ignorance on how to address masking and that developing solutions exceeded FDA's capabilities, considering it problematic to use a brand new, possibly unvalidated tool in the context of an EUA. FDA had validated methods adaptable to demask signals. In a special data run in the new documents, FDA's Dr. Menschik found a muting trend yet to appear in the record. In the related PRR, or proportional reporting ratio analyses required of them by the VAERS standard operating procedure, CDC somewhat accounted for masking. In 2022, Schaffman and Dumouchel published in the leading journal Drug Safety their masking concerns and the improved method, unmasking hundreds of statistical signals for the COVID vaccines, consistent with my analysis. Despite possessing both software and in-house expertise, regulators failed to implement this solution to correct for masking, a striking failure given the accelerated population scale deployment by Operation Warp Speed of a novel and most complex class of drugs ever, mRNA. Compounding further, CDC considered that its PRR analyses were rendered basically redundant by FDA's Bayesian work, discarding its responsibility to generate these PRRs. Accordingly, the United States lacked a fully functional early warning system at the time of its greatest need. Separately, statistical signals were trivialized by avoiding the terms signal or potential safety signal. These failures are incompatible with the so-called enhanced surveillance required by VAERS standard operating procedures. Hindering investigation of potential risks, FDA was obliged to consider, even without having to prove causality, and impugning vaccine injury compensation, authorization, and approval decisions, principle of which was Comirnaty's hastened full approval undertaken while Dr. Schaffman was voicing her concerns. Further, they marginalized those apparently injured by COVID vaccines. Not only did the system fail to perform as advertised, but as the drug safety paper presciently warned, the COVID vaccine reporting deluge likely created masking effects that now compromise signal detection for other vaccines going forward, and there are several papers that describe this. Regulators must swiftly correct masking and other VAERS deficiencies, heeding earlier warnings of their former colleagues, Drs. Marks and Jernigan, who said, failure to detect and communicate a serious health issue related to vaccines could impact confidence not only in COVID vaccines, but in all vaccines. Thank you. I welcome your questions.
Thank you, Dr. Wiseman. Our next witness is Dr. Karl Jablanowski. Dr. Jablanowski is the Director of Science and Research at Children's Health Defense. He holds a master's degree in computer science from the University of Chicago and a PhD in biomedical and health informatics from the University of Washington School of Medicine. His research focuses on bringing about an end to childhood health epidemics. Dr. Jablanowski.
Thank you, Chairman. Pharmacovigilance is absolutely necessary. Our knowledge is limited, even of a vaccine that passes clinical trials of a few thousand very healthy people. We simply do not know what adverse events look like in a diverse, large population until they're administered to a diverse, large population. We had better be watching very closely, which is pharmacovigilance. The vaccines, by honest accounting, were pathetically tested. Pre-EUA, no drug-drug interaction study, no cardiovascular toxicity, central nervous system toxicity, other organ toxicity, blood toxicity, genotoxicity, carcinogenicity. Had they actually turned out to be safe, It would have been serendipitous, a happy accident. Luck is not a pillar of public health. Pharmacovigilance behind closed doors should give everyone pause. It is simply too important to not do it correctly. Lapses can be and were catastrophic. The vigilance heavily depends on three sources of data: the passive surveillance of VAERS, the active surveillance of vSafe, and the VSD, an active system linked to medical records. vSafe was designed to collect inconsequential data. One of the first papers to publish it was a mortality and adverse event study. The only figure in the entire paper was a time series comparison for both Moderna and Pfizer, for both dose 1 and dose 2 of adverse events no one cares about: injection site pain, fatigue, headache, myalgia, chills, and joint pain. Dr. Renata Engler is distinguished in the study of vaccine-induced myocarditis among U.S. military with 4 publications on the smallpox vaccine. On the CDC not including myocarditis in vSafe, she asked, "If you do not ask, you will not see it. But does that mean it does not exist?" Within 50 days of that meeting, Dr. Engler would start adding 4 more publications on COVID-19 vaccine-associated myocarditis. The CDC already had in hand Israel's slides. The vSafe system had 10 million volunteers. About 1/3 entered free text. Perhaps there is some horror found in the 366 individuals who typed in myocarditis, a condition requiring medical diagnosis. That is amplified by the nearly 50,000 people who typed in chest pain. The Vaccine Safety Data Link is a collection of 13 healthcare organizations covering 15.5 million people. It can detect safety issues within a few weeks. Most frequently used is rapid cycle analysis, which can miss delayed onset events. Better and timely options, like the vaccinated versus unvaccinated or pre-post, is rarely used. And they would need the well-practiced extra step of considering differences in healthcare-seeking behavior. By the time the CDC's webpage was updated to warn of inflammation of the heart, 313 million doses were administered to 173 million people. I do not see vigilance at work. With VAERS, the CDC chose to ignore its own standard operating procedure and not run proportional reporting ratios in favor of the FDA's, what Walensky calls more robust and Shimabukuro calls the gold standard. VAERS had been grossly underreported for the first 30 years, maxing out at 58,000 reports. In its 31st year alone, VAERS logged 18 times that number. Because of this disproportionality, the FDA's disproportionality analysis was washed out. Since both vaccines were of the same platform and same adverse events, the comparison was muted. This isn't a blind spot. The FDA was completely blind to adverse events, and the CDC wasn't even looking. There was a savior in the ranks of the FDA who correctly identified the problem, appropriately worked with the inventor of EB data mining to create a solution, communicated the fix to everyone who would listen. The problem is no one listened. Luck was not on our side. The CDC failed to look. The FDA failed to fix a broken system that the CDC touted as the gold standard. The HHS failed to protect us, especially after our freedom of choice was assaulted by the president threatening us all with, "Our patience is wearing thin." FOIA evasion was well practiced and discovered, obviously, not through a FOIA. Simply put, during the largest pharmaceutical rollout in human history, pharmacovigilance did not exist. That is the betrayal of our time, so vast that we cannot even count its casualties.
Thank you, Dr. Jablonski. Our final witness is Ms. Maria Young. Ms. Young will discuss her severe COVID-19 illness and how she spent more than 4 months in the hospital, most of that time in the intensive care unit. During her treatment at Johns Hopkins, she was placed on a ventilator and life support. And Ms. Young, welcome here, and I'm glad you're looking well.
Thank you. My name is Maria Young. Thank you to the committee members for inviting me to share my story today. Survivor, warrior, miracle. These are all words that have been used to describe me over the last 5 years. They aren't words I would have chosen for myself. For me, I was just trying to regain the life I had lost to COVID before we had vaccines or any possible treatments. In 2020, I went from being a healthy, active woman with a full career to being sedated, paralyzed, and placed on life support within days. I became a survivor of severe COVID-19, ARDS, acute respiratory distress syndrome, after spending 69 days on ECMO, extracorporeal membrane oxygenation, and 70 days on a ventilator. I am here because survival is not the end of the story. For those unfamiliar, ECMO is a rare form of life support, used when the lungs can no longer function on their own. Blood is removed from the body, oxygenated by a machine, and returned. It is invasive, complex, and used only when all other options have failed. ECMO does not heal the lungs. It buys hope and a little time. But that hope comes with significant risks: stroke, neurological injury, blood clots, infections, limb loss, organ failure, and of course, death. I spent more than 4 months in the hospital, most of it in the intensive care unit, ICU, most of it in a medically induced coma, and most of it alone. When I finally woke up, I had no memory of the time that had passed and no understanding of how much I had lost. During those months, my family lived through trauma that still echoes today. My mother was told repeatedly that I was not expected to survive. My sister wrote my eulogy. My family prepared themselves for the unimaginable, all without being able to see me in person. Day after day, my mother waited by the phone for a call from my doctor with the update for that day. They carried grief and hope at the same time, a burden that families of critically ill patients know all too well. While I was unconscious, my body endured a long list of complications that many ECMO survivors face. Multiple infections, including one that almost took my vision, blood clots, collapsed lungs, severe muscle wasting and deconditioning, delirium and hallucinations, prolonged sedation and sedation drug withdrawal, blood transfusions, a tracheostomy, a feeding tube, pressure wounds, a deep neck wound from cannulation, and long-term cognitive and physical impacts. These complications are not footnotes. They are the reality of surviving critical respiratory illness. They shape recovery for months and often years. They are especially hard when the diagnosis and treatment lack understanding and support. When I finally woke up, I had to relearn how to breathe, how to swallow, how to sit up, stand, and walk. I had to rebuild my life from the ground up. And while I'm deeply grateful to be alive, gratitude does not erase the trauma. Survival comes with weight, the weight of knowing how close I came to dying and that many others weren't as lucky. When I was discharged, my list of diagnoses included dysautonomia, cognitive impairment, demoralization, severe body deconditioning, long COVID, partial vocal cord paralysis, and post-intensive care syndrome, among others. But alongside that weight is profound gratitude. Gratitude for the nurses who spoke to me even when I was unconscious. Gratitude for the respiratory therapists who taught me how to breathe again. Gratitude for the physical and occupational therapists who celebrated every inch of progress. And gratitude for the doctors at Johns Hopkins who made bold decisions to save me, including placing me on my stomach while on ECMO to try to improve my lung function and oxygenation, something that had never been done before at Johns Hopkins on a patient on ECMO with a tracheostomy. They believed my life was worth fighting for. And gratitude for my community, who held my family up when they could no longer do it on their own. My experience led me to advocacy. Over the last several years, I've connected with hundreds of survivors, people living with long COVID, families, who lost loved ones to COVID-19 or while on ECMO, and ECMO survivors who carry scars both visible and invisible. These communities are full of people who fought for their lives or for their loved ones' lives, and emerged in a world that often moved on without them, many feeling abandoned by systems not built for long-term recovery, by insurance structures that don't recognize the complexity of post-ICU life, and by a public narrative that treats survival as the end of the story. My work is to make sure they are seen, heard, and supported. That's why I stay up to date on my COVID boosters and other vaccinations. I also continue advocacy with organizations like Vaccinate Your Family to share my story through them, through my personal connections, and encourage everyone to continue to get vaccinated against COVID-19 and other diseases in the hopes of helping people avoid the same traumatic experience I and my family went through or worse. Survival should not be followed by fear. It should be followed by support, protection, and the chance to rebuild a life with dignity. Thank you for your time.
Thank you for sharing your story, Ms. Young. I would love to connect you with Breanne Dressen. Many of the things you said are exact same words I've heard from the COVID injection injured. These people were healthy, they were active, now they're permanently disabled. When I first met them, held our first event in Milwaukee, all they wanted was to be seen, heard, and believed. That was their third. Seen, heard, and believed so they could get treatment. They still can't get treatment because they are not being acknowledged. I want to, once I introduce this video, I want to start my Q&A with a 1-minute video. But to set it up, this is a video of recordings of Zoom calls between the vaccine injured. And by the way, React 19, I think I read, they've got something like 40,000 active members. They probably would have more if Facebook hadn't been shutting down their support groups, leading to suicides among those, lack of that support. But this is actually a note in terms of what this video describes here from Breanne Dressen. She writes, beginning in March 2021, seriously COVID-19 vaccine-injured patients were flown to NIH, and this is March 2021, the same time they were made aware of the fact that they were going to mask the safety signals using the algorithm. Vaccine-injured patients were flown to NIH headquarters for extensive testing and evaluation and treatment. Study participants, and I think there are about 23 of them. Study participants received credible diagnoses, including, quote, post-vaccination neuropathy. Again, they were diagnosed as vaccine injured. And specialized treatments the participants say saved their lives. They were incredibly grateful that the NIH, people like Dr. Nath, were paying attention to them and treating them and improving their severe injuries. That same month, NIH researchers began promising participants that the study and their injuries would be made public. And apparently the email where that promise was made was also copied to Peter Marks and acting FDA Commissioner Janet Woodcock. The NIH then asked participants to remain quiet, say nothing, until they disclosed the study themselves. They complied. They feared if they were to go public, they'd lose the treatment, that all the thousands of other injured that were counting on them to be studied, to develop cures, wouldn't receive treatment either. So they stayed silent, holding on to the promise that help is coming for the many others nationwide. That study and the injuries were never disclosed to the public. They were lied to. And this video, again, read my report. Senator Bloom, I cannot believe you read my report based on your opening statement. Read my report. It is irrefutable. But the video is of Peter Marks, head of CBER, the man who was notified on March 1st, 2021, that the safety surveillance system that they were going to use to detect those rare and mild safety signals was invalid. It was going to mask those. It was going to hide those very safety signals. Again, 26 days later, a state-of-the-art system showed 25 safety signals, and I read how severe those adverse events were. But just listen to what Peter Marks, with the knowledge that he was treating vaccine injury, and they weren't mild injuries. These were life-threatening injuries. These were total disability type of injuries. So he knew it. He was treating them. He knew that his safety surveillance system was masking these signals. They lied to them. Listen to what Peter Marks had to say. This is about a minute-long video.
There is incredible BS out there about like thousands of people dying, etc. That just ain't true. No one's denying that adverse events can occur. That doesn't mean that any given individual might not have had something related to the vaccine. I'm not denying anything. The issue is that the number of cases have not risen to a number that leads to a clear differentiation that it's a signal. There's not a clear signal. It just says that we don't have a signal. We continue to query the various databases. The large databases still have not seen a signal. You couldn't really tell. You just couldn't tell whether there was a signal or not. It's something that's been reported, but not as something that is clearly vaccine related.
You guys know we exist. We know that you know that we exist, but the public doesn't think that you guys know that we exist.
That was Brianne Dressen at the very end there. Again, they were pleading with the officials at the FDA, NIH, that knew they were severely injured by the vaccine, counting on them to make that public, to study their results so that others could get treated. To this day, they have not done that. Put up chart number 2 here. Dr. Wiseman. Again, I know you've looked into this in a great deal of depth. You know, probably the very complex mathematical models and algorithms of empirical Bayesian analysis. I'm not a statistician. I'm just a lowly accountant. How in the world could the people who were touting VAERS, Tom Shimabukuro in October of 2020, this is a system that can really detect even small safety signals. They had to hire the contractor that was putting VAERS, the VAERS reports into VAERS. They had to hire thousands of more people because of the overwhelming numbers of reports. Did you need a fancy statistical algorithm to tell you that something was going wrong here with these injections?
Yeah, clearly there's some big alarm bells that are going off there. But I do want to point out that, one of the criticisms of VAERS is that, that stimulated reporting and anyone can report and all that sort of thing. The point about these disproportionality analyses is that it actually removes that from the equation because of the way the mathematics are done. So obviously there's red flags in that sort of chart that you're showing there. But the key point about these disproportionality analyses, the Bayesian data mining, the PRR and others, is that it actually removes that from the equation because of the niceties of how the mathematics are done. So that's really important. So in the list of 49 events that you've listed there, these are all showing signals for the Bayesian data mining, and also not only that, in the PRR method, which is masked. They're showing signals. So whichever way you look at it, there's signals. And the key point, Senator, is that for the purposes of the EUA, the FDA will require to consider not only actual proven risks, but potential risks. And potential risks are represented by signals without necessarily having to prove causality. But in all the decisions, the law is very clear. It says that FDA has to consider actual and potential risks. And by hiding the potential risks in the various ways that you've described, the public were deprived of this knowledge, the doctors were deprived of the knowledge, the ACIP and the VRBAC committees were deprived of this knowledge. So every way you look at it, there's a problem.
So again, so my sophisticated mathematical model, when people push back on this, well, yeah, Senator, it's because we had billions of doses. So we calculated deaths per million doses, compared that to the flu. Again, that's disproportionate, right? Disproportionality. So flu averaged about 0.46 deaths per million. When we did the calculations, 25.5. That's pretty disproportionate to me. Throw
Right.
on, combine it with that. Again, you don't need, they didn't need.
Well,
And again, then they had the vaccine injured in front of them. They were treating them. They are diagnosing them, not with mild, but with life-threatening injuries. Dr. Jablonski, how do you answer that?
Several years ago, Dr. Brian Hooker and I did an analysis of VAERS when we tried to pinpoint when enough VAERS reports had existed to identify myocarditis. And that dates all the way back to the week of February 19th of 2021, which is well before even Israel contacts the CDC saying, we're seeing a whole lot of myocarditis. We want to speak with a relevant expert at CDC. It is way before anyone in the United States that the CDC admitted to them on May 28th.
Okay. They didn't start the clock right away, so I'll yield to my ranking member now.
Thanks, Mr. Chairman. I would like to enter into the record a 2024 study from FDA and CMS, which concluded that there was, quote, no statistically significant association between either mRNA vaccine and stroke. I'd also like to enter into the record a letter from the American Heart Association stating that there is a, quote, substantially elevated risk of stroke from COVID-19 infection. If there's no objection, Mr. Chairman.
Without objection.
There's no clear, let alone convincing evidence that COVID-19 vaccines have caused adverse effects beyond the rare ones that public health officials have acknowledged. There is clear evidence that COVID-19 itself is linked with many worse adverse events, including stroke. And there are signs that the administration is regretting its implied or explicit opposition to the use of vaccines in America today, because they are so contrary to what people across the country really believe and correctly believe, that vaccines actually do save lives. I'd like to ask Ms. Young a couple of questions, but first I want to thank you again. Obviously, this moment is a very, very difficult one for you, as it would be for anyone, recalling almost 70 days in a coma, 200 plus days in a hospital, in intensive care, near death. At the time you entered the hospital, there were no vaccines available. By the time you finished life support, there were multiple vaccines, and millions of people had been inoculated. And so, in a sense, your story is about re-entering the world, a different world, a better world that would have saved you from this horrific ordeal. But this basic truth, this miraculous outcome during the time that you were unconscious, became tarnished when opportunists began raising false alarms and warned of hidden harms from vaccines while hawking untested supplements. Fearmongers attacked the scientists and public health officials who had brought us out of one of the darkest hours in our nation's history. And people angered by measures taken to contain the virus claimed the threat that it posed was never real to begin with. So I guess my first question is, do you remember when you first learned that a vaccine against COVID-19 had become available, and how did you feel?
When I woke up, my first question was, who did I get sick? Because I assumed, everyone I had been near had gotten sick, and nobody had. But I remember laying in my hospital bed. I was kind of waking up and still going through delirium, and they had the TV on. And I was watching the news, and it felt really surreal because people were getting vaccinated. Healthcare workers were starting to get vaccinated. And I just remember feeling like a little sense of relief that nobody else will, this will stop. Life will go back to what it was before, potentially. And my family, my parents and my sister were actually able to get vaccinated the day they picked me up from the hospital. By coincidence, there was availability, and they also felt just a sense of relief and hope.
And you look great, if I may say. I've seen some of the pictures of how you looked when you were in the hospital, and I wouldn't recognize you, which attests to, I think, the quality of care that you received at Johns Hopkins, and thanks to those docs and all the specialists and the nurses and all the heroes, not just there, but all around the country, who believe in vaccines, who believe in science. How has the experience of battling for your life against COVID-19 affected how you feel about vaccines?
I don't think I thought about vaccines much before. We just had them. They kept us safe. They had eradicated several diseases. And then afterwards, it kind of was like, why didn't it happen sooner? Or why couldn't I have benefited from it? And for a long time, I thought, why me? Why did I get this sick? And then as I learned more about COVID and about all the data that came out of it, I said, well, why not me? I was 41, I was healthy, I didn't have pre-existing conditions. I was the reason that we needed a vaccine.
Well, I don't know the answer to your question, why me? But I do know that you are doing enormous good by being here today. And as painful as that experience was, I think we owe you, all of us owe you a debt of gratitude for your bravery and your strength in coming here today and sharing your story. So I want to thank you for being here today. Thank you.
Senator Marino.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I will echo the ranking member's comments. Thank you, Mrs. Young, for being here. I assume that's your mom. Friend, okay. I got in trouble. My wife's back there going, don't ever say stuff like that. But, well, I can see the pain is with you and your family, and I'm sure you're never going to forget what that was like, and thank you for being here, and thank you for sharing your story. I think sometimes when we have this conversation about what happened during COVID, and I think the ranking member said, remember what it was like. And I do remember what it was like, and quite frankly, the government did a lot of good. I think certainly in your case, the vaccine helped you, but the government did tremendous things that were very, very bad. For example, in my home state of Ohio, we had a health director that recommended that we shut down schools. And those schools were shut down for 18 months. And we know now that under 18, you really didn't have much of an effect from COVID. There were 0 deaths in that category. And yet we destroyed the lives of those kids. I think we can trace back to that day the youth violence problem that we have today. We had people that were totally disconnected, including my youngest son, who spent his senior year in college taking classes remotely. And I can tell you, he didn't learn anything because there was no interaction with kids. And that's a college, somebody's senior year in college. You think about some of the important grades like 9th grade that are critical, 3rd grade that you need that socialization skill, 8th grade where you're going to graduate into high school. We just robbed those kids. And Dr. Wiseman, what are your thoughts just as a scientist? Don't you think that there should be some idea of building confidence in our healthcare system and that there needs to be a certain amount of humility that says, hey, maybe we don't know all the data, but you certainly are, you should be giving people the best data that you have and yet it seemed like it was a very one-dimensional data set that said, this is the only thing we're going to tell you, this is the only thing you believe. And if you even questioned anything outside this data set or narrative, you're just a bad human being.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. And I actually want to echo Senator Blumenthal's comments that, you know, what was it like? I mean, it was chaos. And for the most part, everyone was trying to do a very, very difficult job and a very hard job. I think everyone would thank all the healthcare providers and the people in the government and so on, but there were specific failures. And you know, the testimony we heard was very compelling. And as someone who's been an advocate for patients with chronic conditions that are ignored and so on, I definitely empathize with the comments that we heard. But the thing that echoed with me a moment ago was that why me? And the why me that happened to me that answers your question, Senator, is that I hadn't thought about vaccines. I'd taken all the usual vaccines, so had my family. I had no history with doing any work with vaccines. And for a curious set of circumstances, I got involved in analyzing hydroxychloroquine data, which I wasn't very impressed with, frankly. But I found an error in one of the key studies that was used to close down hydroxychloroquine. And I argue with the authors, Bulwer, in Minnesota, to give me the data that was missing, that I discovered was missing. They gave me the data. And those data showed, when you plugged them in, that there was actually an effect of hydroxychloroquine. That was one of the 2 studies that closed down hydroxychloroquine. When I tried to get that published in the New England Journal of Medicine in January 2021, when thousands of people were dying, as Senator Blumenthal correctly described, okay, the response that I got from the New England Journal of Medicine was, well, we don't think this is going to be of very much interest to any one of our readers. And at that point, I said, there's a really big problem here. So
because again, there was a narrative, and if you even questioned this narrative, you were somehow a bad human being. But let's remind also what happened. You had a scenario where we have a lot of people on the other side of the aisle that like to say President Trump's an authoritarian. President Trump hasn't threatened to fire employees for companies or military members who refuse to have sovereignty over their bodies. Under Biden, 9,000 members of the military were dismissed because they refused to put an experimental vaccine into their bodies. I mean, how did we get to that place, Dr. Weiser? How did we get to the place where I can decide for myself what I put into my own body? And if that means I want to take the vaccine, then good for you. But if I decide not to, I lose my ability to make a living, especially people who put on a uniform to defend this country. How is that possible?
Well, I mean, as a scientist, I'm also a pharmacist. You know, looking at what the law says, not as a lawyer, I let the lawyers figure out the legal aspects of it, but as a scientist, as a pharmacist, the EUA requirement required the Secretary of the HHS to make sure there are adequate systems to detect and monitor safety and to inform doctors and the patients who are receiving the vaccines of known and potential risks so that they could make that sort of informed consent about what to put in their body. And according to the findings of Senator Johnson and his staff, they were effectively deprived of that because the safety systems that were designed and advertised as you know, detecting safety issues were not working. They were not working. The early warning system was turned off, and the problem still exists going forward for all vaccines. We want vaccine confidence. I agree with the lady over here. We want confidence in vaccines, but based on Dr. Sharfman's paper and other papers, going forward, there's a problem with using these systems unless they are corrected. So we have to have humility, Senator. You're absolutely right. We have to have the ability that people have all the right decisions, all the right information to make the decisions so they can do exactly what you've described.
And isn't it okay just to say, hey, look, this was a tough time. It's a tough history of the country. We had a lot of horrible situations going on, and we made mistakes, and just acknowledge that there's mistakes. In my mind, that makes it easier for us to respond to a future pandemic if the government has humility and transparency to say, we really, really screwed up. Dr. Jablanowski, you must have a good email address, probably the only one there, but briefly talk about what was the effect that somebody like Dr. Amy Acton in Ohio recommending schools to be closed, forcing children to be vaccinated, and by the way, bribing kids to get vaccinated by giving them money. So the state of Ohio is giving kids money and rewards if they got vaccinated. What's the long-term effects, you think, of a policy like that on children, which I know you care a lot about?
There are many long-term effects, certainly social and educational, but the one that sticks out to me the most is the lesson that we are teaching the next generation. Bodily autonomy, as you pointed out, it's our basic unit of liberty. I honestly, unfortunately, believe we live in a country that we could not have founded because we do not believe we have bodily autonomy. If we did, on September 9th, 2021, when Joe Biden, threatened us all with our patience is wearing thin, stated the obvious, that this is not about freedom or personal choice, declared the vaccines to be safe, and described a pandemic of the unvaccinated, he wouldn't have been in office in the next day. But he is. He was. And on your point of humility of the situation, I think that is the perfect word, because the then Secretary of HHS could have changed history with one word. He could have summoned the greatest army of statisticians and mathematicians and data scientists ever assembled under one topic with one word. That word was help. Please help. We launched a pathetically tested vaccine onto the population, and our only reporting system was overbearing by the number of reports. We can't actually use the system. Please help. Or the expert at the FDA is working with the expert in the world, describing that our system isn't working, has a better system, but we don't like their answers. Please help. It would have saved a lot.
Thank you,
Senator
Mr. Chairman.
Hawley.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Thanks to all of the witnesses for being here. Dr. Wiseman, if I could just start with you. It seems pretty clear to me, based on the testimony that we've heard today, based on the investigation that this committee has done and what we've learned over the last few years, that what we saw during COVID wasn't so much a public health campaign as it was a profit machine. A profit machine for the big pharma companies who made billions and billions of dollars off of a vaccine that they did not adequately test, about which they did not adequately disclose health risks. They made out like bandits, though. I mean, this is great for them. All of the public health problems get offloaded onto other people, namely the American people. All of the costs get borne by the patients. They don't have to do anything, and they get rich off of it. I mean, let me just ask you, in your professional opinion, did these companies like Pfizer and Moderna, did they adequately study and disclose any of the risks that were associated with these vaccines before they were forced upon the public?
Well, I think there was a lot of collaboration, and it was stated openly. The government, the FDA, the CDC were working very closely with the drug companies. So this wasn't a normal sort of development of drugs that we see in history. So a lot of the stuff that the companies were sort of got away with, as it were, was with the consent of FDA, who generously interpreted regulations concerning certain types of testing, genotoxicity or lipid nanoparticle testing or biodistribution or whatever it is. And in one of the attachments in my testimony, there's 248 questions that detail that very specifically. So while the drug companies ultimately are responsible for their product, maybe they should have taken the view of, well, even if the government says we can get away with it, we're not going to. So there were clearly things that they knew, and they over generously interpreted cancer studies, genotoxicity studies, biodistribution studies, and in the particular case of Pfizer, there was the very egregious non-disclosure of a particular sequence in the plasmid that was used to manufacture the product of a particular sequences that derived from an SV40 virus. It wasn't the whole virus. There were particular sequences in that, but they specifically in FOIA requests that we've had from different countries, Pfizer chose not to disclose those sequences. A very significant, I think, abuse of public trust, given that they had this sweetheart of a deal, all the marketing was done for them by the government. That is a particularly egregious example.
Let me just ask you if you've encountered other instances where adverse event data was downplayed or disregarded or even outright concealed by either the manufacturers or public health authorities in a way that had the effect of protecting corporate interests over patient safety.
You mean outside of COVID?
No, in the COVID context. I mean, you've named a couple. Are there others that we should be aware of?
I mean, I think everything, it's all to, the question is, even though we've been discussing the Bayesian data mining that the FDA conducted, we don't know what systems the Pfizer and Moderna were using. They also have a responsibility for pharmacovigilance. So I think a valid question is to ask, you know, what were they finding? What systems were they using? Were they adequately understanding of the limitations of those systems, and to what extent were they reporting them to the government? So I can't give you more specific examples than what we've already seen.
What reforms would you recommend Congress pursue to ensure that this sort of future public health emergency, that in cases like this that we saw in COVID, that pharmaceutical companies, private companies are held accountable for adverse events? They're not getting the sweetheart deal that you've been describing.
Well, I think there has to be a greater separation between the government and the pharmaceutical companies, understanding that it was an emergency situation. There had to be an element of collaboration. So there is something there, but there has to be some separation. But going forward, specifically for in the subject matter of what we're discussing today, there are some major reforms of VAERS that have to take place. In terms of making sure that data is properly collected. There's a person called Albert Benavides who's done a great job at documenting that. The companies should be required to be using the modified Bayesian methods. The PRR methods should also be used with caveats. And there has to be adequate oversight of exactly how these signals are going to be implemented or understood. The VSD, there was also, actually to your earlier question, again, this was a VSD issue that they actually had seen signals for myocardial infarction and venous thromboembolism in May of 2022, but they didn't report them in the public domain until about a year later. So that was a concealment, but again, that was on the part of the VSD program, not specifically the manufacturers. So there's a whole slew of things that have to happen in terms of how we analyze data. The senator mentioned making sure that we actually get rates of adverse events that are based on actual usage, which we could have done in the earlier part of the COVID vaccine. We could have done that. And I did that analysis together with Dr. Getsko from the Hebrew University, and we normalized it the right way. We sent that to Dr. Evans, who was the father of the PRR method, that's equivalent to the Dr. Dumichel. And at the moment when we sent that to him in England, he just closed down on us. So clearly there's got to be something within the government that says we've got to look at these things and take people seriously. And someone like Anna Schaafman and Dr. Michel, who are the father and mother of these methods, were being ignored. These weren't just any people. This was the father and the mother, as it were, of these methods. They need to be listened to and not marginalized, not being told to cease and desist. You know, we don't want to know what you've got to say. I think that's terrible. And we need to understand what processes happened to make that situation possible.
You know, I think that the government working with private companies in the midst of a health crisis is one thing, collaboration is one thing, but systematically concealing from the public the true risks involved with this vaccine in a way that not only misled patients, that not only misled parents, that not only endangered the lives of children, but had the net effects of lining the pockets of the biggest pharma companies in the world, that is a disgrace. That is an absolute disgrace. And I just think, Mr. Chairman, that is what we have got to learn from this crisis. Somebody did profit off of it. You know, I mean, we talk about, oh, COVID was good for nobody. Not quite true. It was very good for a handful of pharma companies who got the sweetheart deal with the government, who made billions of dollars off of it, and as usual, got to offload all of their potential liability onto somebody else and walk away from it. And now they are sitting pretty, and the patients are told, sorry, you know, oh, we lied to you, sorry, but at least the companies got rich. We've got to change this so this never happens again.
They have responsibility, a moral responsibility, in my opinion. Even whatever the government says, you know, they have to go beyond the letter and say, okay, you know, we think there's a problem here. We have to look at our product honestly and say, okay, you know, we have to disclose all the risks, even though the FDA allows us to say certain things. Sorry.
Senator Hall, there's, I think it's an Oxfam study that shows trillions of dollars transfer to not just pharma, but the big box stores. It's all the little guys that got shut down. The big guys did phenomenally well. But I do want Dr. Jablonski to answer your question in terms of, because I think he missed his opening testimony. He listed all of this tests that they did not do in the approval process. Can you quick read that list again?
Certainly. It was, there were pre-EUA, there were no tests done on drug-drug interactions, cardiovascular toxicity, central nervous system toxicity, other organ toxicity, blood toxicity, genotoxicity, or carcinogenicity. So, and I then went on to say,
then they hit all kinds of things. And by the way, if you really want to know the abuse, talk to Bree Dressen, talk to Stephanie Manny DeGarry, who actually participated in the trials, AstraZeneca and Pfizer, and how they were completely abandoned. Manny DeGarry, I think at the time maybe 12 to 13-year-old little girl, she couldn't walk. She was in a wheelchair. She had to have a feeding tube. She could. In the report from Pfizer, they listed that as a stomach ache. Bree Dressen, who has amassed hundreds of thousands of dollars in medical bills. AstraZeneca, I think, sent her a check for $1,300, something like that. And that settles it. So no, they were abandoned by the companies that they participated in the trials in, okay? And then they were abandoned by the officials of the FDA who treated them, acknowledged that they were vaccine injured, and then never told the public about it. And so we've got a real big problem in this country about vaccine injury deniers. Okay, again, these vaccine injuries are real, but it's being denied. You know, Mr. Science himself, you know, accused a lot of people of being science deniers. I'll accuse people of being vaccine injured deniers. And, you know, the study, these, you know, I've got to point this out. We're going to start this. Put up number 8. I had this chart for my November 21st, and Dr. Wiseman, you might have actually been at this public event with the vaccine injured. And the blue lines are the number of the new cases per day. And so you can see this is December 2020, right there. When the vaccine was approved and started being administered, you can see the number of cases pretty well peaked late 2020, early 2021, and started coming all the way down. The orange line is the uptake, the percentage of the Americans who were vaccinated with the COVID injection. Now, if it was effective, if it really would have worked, you'd think that the number of cases would just tailed off. But that's not what happened. So at a previous hearing, put up number 4. Okay, well, if you just 2 seconds. At a previous hearing, you put up no, not that one. You put up a study from Commonwealth Fund saying that the vaccine saved 3.2 million lives. So I'm just going to, again, just my simple math, just prove how incredibly farcical that is. So if you just take a look at...
I don't know any simple math. It's all complex to me.
This is simple addition. So if you take a look at actual deaths up to the pandemic, 2019, about 2.8 million deaths. Now, if you just grow that, and of course, population is growing or aging, so it's growing compound annual growth rate a little under 1% a year. By about 2024, we'd have about 3.1 million deaths. We were projected about 2.9 for the pandemic year. Let's take a look at what actually happened. So the year pandemic, we went from 2.9 million deaths to 3.4. Obviously something was happening. People like Ms. Young suffered the result. 500,000 Americans died. Now, the vaccine came on board in 2021. You would think, again, if we pretty well, I hate to use the word culled the herd, but I mean the most vulnerable people died in 2020. So by 2021, the year of the vaccine, you would expect, if it was that effective, that number, if you would have been saving 3.2 million lives, by the way, just that's in 2021, 2022, you'd think that number would have come down. No, it went up to 3.5 million deaths. 2022 came down a little bit to 3.3. So let's put up the last one. Now, in order to make the claim that 3.2 million lives were saved in 21 and 2022, you would have had to assume that once the vaccine came on board, we were really expecting 5 million deaths in both 2021 and 2022. So that Commonwealth Fund is that study, that mathematical model, kind of like the Veyer's algorithm, it's complete bunk. It's complete BS. The vaccine did not save 3.2 million lives in America. What it did do is it had some serious adverse events to the tune of about 1.7 million currently on Veyer's, 39,000 worldwide, and we know it dramatically understates what that number was.
Mr. Chairman, can I ask a quick question? Ms. Young, you've sat through all this stuff. If you had it to do over again, would you have gotten the vaccine?
Oh, yeah, without question.
You would have gotten it, even knowing that there were potential adverse effects and side effects, which, frankly, there are with any kind of medicine these days. You still would have gotten the vaccine.
Yeah, and that's kind of how I think about it. Anything we take, medicine, vitamins, like everything comes with a risk. It was a measured risk at the time. And yeah, I don't regret my decision at all.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And again, to Ms. Young, thank you for being here today.
Okay.
I apologize to the witnesses, and Mr. Chairman, I have a hearing of the Veterans Affairs Committee. Our world is many obligations at the same time, so I do apologize that I can't be here for the rest of the
I appreciate that. So in my letter to Secretary Kennedy of December 15th, point number 10, I point out a Rasmussen study. Again, this is a poll of all the American people that showed that 28% of the American public believe they personally knew somebody whose death may have been caused by the COVID injection. 28%. That same poll said that about 48% of Americans agree, quote, that there are legitimate reasons to be concerned about the safety of the COVID-19 vaccines. Again, doesn't prove causation, but this is what people experienced in the American public. This is what they saw. Now, Peter Marks and everybody else saying safe and effective, but what the public saw, and I saw this with people I knew, very serious side effects, including one person I think died. Now, a lot of people didn't want to admit it. Their loved ones who encouraged them to get that shot didn't want to admit that maybe that's what killed them. I never asked the question. I always had the suspicion with like 28% of the other American population. Dr. Jablonski, you talked about VSafe. Talk a little bit about what it showed and what it didn't show. I mean, what it was trying to track. And again, I mean, the adverse events, as you said in your testimony, the things that nobody really cared that much about. It's the small stuff. It wasn't deaths, it wasn't myocarditis, but just talk a little bit about that.
Right. So the VSafe system was designed to actually pick up subclinical findings, which in theory would be good. Because the VSD, what most of the health institutions rely on, are only what is presented clinically. However, in all honesty, the COVID-19 vaccine rollout was a freight train going 100 miles per hour, and nothing was going to stop it. Now, VSafe was designed to ask 10 questions that nobody cared about, that was never going to stop this. If all 10 million people had checked all 10 boxes every time they were prompted, I still do not think it would have made a lick of difference.
But it also asked you to determine, did you seek medical care after your vaccination, correct?
That is correct.
And 7.7% of the people, of the 10 million people, sought medical care after their injection. Now, is that unusually high for any medication or any vaccine?
That seems awfully unusually high. The number of skipped work days, I believe,
25%.
Also unbelievably high.
Dr. Wiseman, one of the things that is not widely publicized is certainly the Pfizer, might have been true of the Moderna as well, but I know the Pfizer got the emergency use authorization based on a certain process, very low batch process number 1. But that's not what the American people or the world got, is it? You want to describe the potential problems of them switching the process just regulatorily in terms of that's probably not what should happen,
right?
But also the danger of that new process, particularly when we know that people like Kevin McKiernan are talking about massive amounts of DNA above and beyond the acceptable limits.
Okay, so in general, any time in any medical pharmaceutical product, if a manufacturer changes the manufacturing process, it triggers a very, very careful review of does this change the safety and efficacy of the product? Okay, that's a general principle that everyone knows. The material that was used by Pfizer, the so-called Process 1 material, the RNA was made in a certain way using a certain method, and only once the vaccine was authorized in December 2021, or just slightly before then, they introduced what would be the Process 2, which was going to be using a bacteria with these things called plasmids, and it turns out there's also these SC40 sequences, but they were using the similar process that Moderna was using all the time. And there was supposed to be a comparator study done with 250 patients to show that the new material was acting the same way as the old material. That actually wasn't done, even though it was slated to be done. So that's a huge issue. And by switching the processes, it introduced different risks and different profiles into the product that haven't been properly studied. And FDA allowed Pfizer to slide and not even do that comparison study. There was actually a Process 3. And the Process 3 was about in end of 2021, where Pfizer changed the diluent, the liquid vehicle that the vaccine was carried in from one kind of solution to another kind of solution, which again wasn't properly characterized. And that was really called Process 3. So what was in the clinical studies, even though there was lots of problems with the clinical studies as well, which that's a different problem, the public did not get the product that was the part of the clinical studies. In the case of Moderna, there were also some changes that happened to do with certain RNA sequences that were in the product. Again, there were questions that EMA, particularly the Europeans, were very careful in asking questions to Pfizer and Moderna about different aspects of their process. They asked good questions, and this is work that I did with Dr. Maria Gucci. They asked good questions. We went through those documents extensively. And then they got some kind of very perfunctory answer, and it seems like they were sort of told to, lie down and not do anything more. So on multiple occasions in both companies, there were lots of irregularities as to what the questions that were being asked about the manufacturing that weren't being properly answered.
Dr. Jablonski, it kind of speaks to another problem you have is when you have no product liability. All the effort goes into getting a drug or a vaccine approved, but because you have no liability, once it's approved, there's not a whole lot of effort on anybody's part, right? I mean, the regulators who have approved it, they don't want to be proven wrong. The vaccine manufacturers, they're certainly not going to be, raising their hand and go, oh, by the way, we better pull this thing because we're seeing all kinds of problems. You've seen that with childhood vaccines as well. Do you want to just kind of describe that problem of, lack of liability for these products and what that produces from a standpoint of post-licensure behavior?
Yeah, I think that if there was no product liability for automobiles, we'd still be driving around in Model Ts. There is no development. There's no pressure to develop a better and safer. And in fact, there is a disincentive for them to look. It's actually a violation of the fiduciary duty to their shareholders if they actually look at their own product and find a problem. And so we are left powerless over this system that cannot be corrected by capitalistic forces if there is a liability shield. We just can't be.
So the vaccines got the emergency use authorization different times. They were licensed about August of 2021. Again, I was looking at VAERS early on. I remember a conversation I had with Francis Collins at the end of April when there were about 2,900 deaths reporting on VAERS. 46% of those, because we were administering to elderly, the frailer individuals. 46% of those deaths were occurring on the day of vaccination or within 1 or 2 days. And I asked Dr. Collins about that. So, Senator, we've identified 6 cases where we've proved causation between the Johnson & Johnson vaccine and women of childbearing age. I said, in terms of the other 2,900, Senator, people die. So I'll close out with that thought in terms of the incentives or the lack of incentives for the companies, the regulators who approve these things to rigorously follow them for safety problems, because they don't want to admit they were wrong in approving them in the first place. They don't want to admit that shots or injections that they were doing videos on, telling everybody you have to get, that's why God gave you 2 arms, shot in a booster in each arm. I mean, nobody that pushed these things wants to admit they are wrong. The advice they gave might have resulted in somebody's death or permanent disability. That's what we're faced with. That's why we have this massive vaccine injury and injection injury denying going on in this country. And I can tell you from my standpoint, I'm not giving up. I'm not caving to the vaccine deniers. I'm not caving to the ridicule and vilification. I think my next hearing on this will probably bring in the injection injured. Now that we have this report, and again, look at the timing of this. Peter Marks was made aware of this in March of 2021, the same time the NIH was treating people and they were admitting these people were injured by the COVID injection. They were promised that they would be studied, that would be made public, their injuries would be made public. And here we are, end of April 2026, that hasn't happened. I'm on a mission to make sure that happens. So again, I want to thank all the witnesses. Again, Ms. Young, I appreciate the fact you're here. I really encourage you, if you allow me, I will put you in connection with the brand dress and their, you're going to be dealing with the same issues, okay? You haven't been seen, you haven't been heard, nor have they. I think it could really be a good conversation. Okay, wonderful, we'll do that. But the record for this hearing will remain open for 15 days until 5 p.m. on Thursday, March 14th, 2026 for the submission of the statements and questions for the record. This hearing is adjourned.